Our first recipient is Robert Cohen. Robert Cohen is a professor of history and social studies at NYU's Steiner School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His historical scholarship focuses on politics, higher education, and social protest in 20th century America. And we honor him today for his book, Confronting Jim Crow, Race, Memory, and the University of Georgia in the 20th Century. In his book, Professor Cohen explores the University of Georgia's struggle to overcome its long and troubled racial history, shedding light on white Georgia's historical amnesia concerning the university's role in sustaining the state's system of Jim Crow. The book extends the historical analysis beyond the desegregation crisis of 1961 and through the lens of Black and white students, faculty, and administration perspectives. The book exposes the enduring impact of Jim Crow and its lingering effects on the storied Athens campus. And so, it's my pleasure to present a 2025 Lillian Smith Book Award to Professor Cohen for unearthing hidden truths about a story with which many of us thought we were familiar. Professor Cohen.
Well, I want to thank you for this honor. First of all, it's an honor to be here with Crystal Sanders, whose book I love, and I hope you all read. Also, because this honors Lillian Smith, it's a special meaning to me because I've always admired her, and just finished a book on Dr. King called Not Dreaming, Martin Luther King's Critique of America, and I know that he and Lillian Smith were friends, and so this award means a lot to me. I just wanted, before I get started on my text, I want to thank my colleagues, my former colleagues in the University of Georgia History Department, the late Bill McFilley, John Insko, Robert Pratt, and more recently, China Kylie and Scott Nesbitt, also late Tom Dyer. There was, when I was at Georgia, a community of, I guess you'd say, dissident scholars who were trying to take an honest, critical look at Georgia history and the University of Georgia. So I'm grateful for that community, as well as outside the History Department, Maurice Daniels in social work, who later on became the dean there, not only did books around it, biographies of people like Donald Hollowell and Judge Hartsmore, but also a documentary film. So I'm really part of the movement, I think, not a solo actor. I was thinking on the way here, as I was reflecting on the book, that it has a kind of terrible relevancy. And by that I mean that somebody who studied this history, this tragic history of racism and the heroic struggle against it, seems increasingly relevant because of what's been going on in this country for the last few years especially. I'm reminded how Dr. King would often talk about racism as a kind of sickness. And in his last speech, in Memphis. He talked about the racist mayor of Memphis, Mayor Loeb, being sick with racism and being callous towards the sanitation workers who were on strike. And he said that the mayor, Loeb, is in dire need of a doctor. And I have to say that when I see the current president of the United States talking about race, I feel the same way. Some things that just don't get talked about anymore, like when he was slandering Haitian immigrants as eating the dogs and the cats of the people who live there, and talking about Springfield, Ohio, as if they're not people. And that's just, we could spend the whole night talking about that, but I think it really shows that we need to have a serious engagement with understanding the history of racism and its persistence, because this is not a marginal issue. We're in an age of white grievance politics, white nationalism, and a kind of attempt to erase black history, and from the very top of the administration in Washington. So I think this is more important than ever. But I just want to say, too, it's not just a problem with the president. It's this plurality of support that he had. And the way I understand it, there's a scholar of Nazi Germany named Ian Kershaw, who talked about public opinion in Nazi Germany. Not that most people were not fanatical, genocidal Nazis, but many, many more were morally indifferent. And that's what I see in this country right now. So I hope that both my book and Crystal's get read and that we can push back on this. So that's just a preface to what I want to say tonight. In titling my book on UGA and race, Confronting Jim Crow, I had several ironies in mind. We have time today to explore only the most obvious irony, which applies to the white side of the Jim Crow color line. Because almost nobody at UGA in the first 60 years of the 20th century proved willing and able to confront Jim Crow, to publicly criticize legally ordained racial segregation and anti-black discrimination in the segregated South, or to object to bigoted ideas, or even to the shockingly crude racist language in UGA student publications in the Jim Crow era. Why? A state and campus-wide segregationist consensus, check. Peer pressure from classmates and threats of censorship from powerful Georgia politicians and UGA officials against students who criticize segregation, check. A lack of academic freedom for faculty to question segregation, check. A curriculum that either condescended to or ignored blacks and their history, check. Since we are here tonight at the ceremony honoring Lillian Smith, one of the white Georgia's, as you said, few prominent critics of Jim Crow, let me take an example from UGA's history that involves her. Back in 1955, a liberal UGA philosophy professor, Paul Fetzer, dared to criticize Jim Crow. Fetzer, a Quaker pacifist, had written to Representative Adam Clayton Powell, Congress's one of its most prominent, maybe the most prominent black civil rights advocate in Congress at the time, and he praised Powell for his stance against conscription and against racial discrimination and segregation. Impressed by getting this kind of letter from someone from the University of Georgia, surprised, he read it into the congressional record. Whoa. When that became public, Fetzer became the target of a harassment campaign by his dean. Though Fetzer had a divinity degree, a doctorate from Yale, and was the UGA philosophy department's chair and its most well-published scholar, he was shaken by the dean's offensive against him, realizing that his job was in danger. So in July of 1955, Fetzer wrote to his friend Lillian Smith describing the situation and asking her for her advice and support. He told, in that letter to Smith, he told Lillian Smith that he was summoned to the dean's office and read the Riot Act, making it clear that he was persona non grata and that he could expect no increases in rank or salary, nor further support for our department until he resigned or kept silent or rolled over and played dead. The dean even threatened to get rid of the philosophy department if they could not get rid of me, Fetzer wrote, in other ways. Smith's response to her friend Fetzer was impressive and depressing. Impressive because of Smith's quick and sympathetic response. She wrote a letter immediately, like a long letter in response right away. Depressing because Fetzer, who thought pressure to purge him, which originated from segregation, he thought the segregationist politicians in Atlanta were responsible for this attempt to purge him. He was hoping that because Lillian Smith was a famous author, she might be able to put some pressure to find out who in Atlanta had put this pressure on this department dean of the school to get rid of him, and maybe that pressure could be used to stop the purge. But Lillian Smith had no such contacts. As she explained, "I have no powerful friends. I am far more hated than you and feared by all those people." She urged him not to resign, and that if it came to it, to make UJ fire him, so that she and the ACLU, she was on its board, could publicize the university's crushing of anti-racist dissent. Fetzer agreed to try to hang on, writing that, quote, "It is a matter of simple justice, of whether we are going to make democracy really work or lose it by default," something a lot of us are thinking about these days. But he became worn down and fed up with UGA's hostile work environment, the repressive Jim Crow ethos that rendered his colleagues timid and cautious and fearful under the constant pounding of the extremists. Those are his words, timid and cautious and fearful under the constant pounding of extremists. So in 1959, he decided he could take no more, and he left UGA for Vassar College, where he became a much admired and beloved professor of religion and philosophy until his retirement. This repressive environment, which drove Fetzer out of Georgia, rendered faculty fearful of speaking out publicly against Jim Crow, or teaching about the system's oppression of African Americans, or doing much of anything in their classes to challenge their students' white supremacist assumptions. Even though it had been decades since America's leading social scientists, such as Otto Kleinberg, had refuted the racist myths denigrating black intelligence, such myths persisted in UGA's student body, which was really disconnected from modern scholarship on race. And that includes the elite of Georgia, like people like the Talmadges and Vandiver. They weren't learning modern social science in their classes, or if they were, it was going out one ear and out the other. The result was an astounding degree of ignorance among UGA students on race, integration, civil rights, black history, and on all the modern scholarship on those important topics. I encountered overwhelming evidence of this ignorance some 30 years ago in my initial research on UGA and race. This was my study published as a Georgia Historical Quarterly article in 1996, thanks to the brilliant editorship of John Insko, my friend in the history department there. It was a study of the essays a class of calculus students wrote about their views on UGA's integration a week after a racist riot rocked the university in its January 1961 integration crisis. Those 34 essays expressed just about every racist myth imaginable, from inherent black criminality to black intellectual inferiority, even blacks having abnormal skull sizes. It was just an incredible group of essays to read. And on civil rights, absurdly equating the NAACP with a communist plot to destroy America. Those essays also revealed that when students discussed the roots of their racial ideas, or really the roots of their racial miseducation really, it was almost always their family, their friends, and their communities on the white side of the color line. Their ignorance and bigotry were homegrown. 33 of the 34 students in that class cited nothing that they had learned at school or the university. There had been no educational intervention to challenge this racism. This was because UGA's curriculum was designed and taught by professors who were often afraid of racial controversy because their jobs would be at stake. This helps to explain how it could be that UGA became the site of a disgraceful student-organized race riot in alliance with the Ku Klux Klan outside of Charlene Hunter. She was the first African-American woman student outside of her dormitory in January 1961. A riot designed to rid UGA of Charlene and her fellow integrationist pioneer, Hamilton Holmes. And the riot was modeled on a previous riot years earlier at the University of Alabama that had rid the university of its first black student, Arthur and Lucy. And this riot occurred at Georgia the first night after Hamilton and Charlene had attended their first classes. And it took the entire Athens police force to suppress this riot, along with Dean Tate, who was injured in the melee, and it took tear gas as well to end the riot, and the State Patrol mysteriously never showed up. The lesson from this history for us today seems crystal clear, that the recent repressive legislation imposed on schools by numerous red states seeking to ban as divisive education on the history and legacy of racism, most notably in DeSantis' Florida, but also here in Georgia, and the Trump administration's agenda to censor African-American history and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian is not going to make America great again, It's going to make Americans, especially students, ignorant again. UGA's Jim Crow experience offers us a warning that we must not return to the kind of racial miseducation that afflicted the Jim Crow South, but that certainly seems where we are headed, to a school world and society that are no more able to confront racism and Jim Crow's legacy than were the UGA students and faculty who I studied when UGA was a segregated university bereft of academic freedom. What is especially troubling about all this is that even before Trumpism, we were not doing all that well in this crucial area of education. In fact, back in 2011, on the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides and Bob Moses' courageous voting rights organizing in Mississippi, I asked Bob why he thought so few Americans knew of the work that he and SNCC had done in Mississippi between 1961 and 65, and the racist terrorism they had to overcome as they sought to end decades of black disenfranchisement. Bob replied, "The country does not do a good job of showing that the country's history is equally about the tough issues of slavery and Jim Crow as it is about revolution and freedom. America is inclined towards just really painting a facade over the history. So that's the problem." I realize that all this can be depressing when we reflect upon the world we are in today, with the White House wedded to white grievance politics, in which books like mine can so easily be dismissed or even banned from schools as woke. The work, in Trump's favorite demeaning phrase, of radical left lunatics. Having just last Thursday conducted a makeup class with my African American students who have been afraid to attend class, this is in New York, the prior week after racist death threats have been directed at NYU's black community as well as numerous HBCUs, it is difficult to be upbeat. All the more so because this is a time when demagogic politicians, including the president, insist that history should be little more than an exercise in flag-waving nationalism, or as Trump put it, a history designed to show that America is a hot country. But writing history to serve such narrow nationalistic aims is a dead end, especially if we consider political scientist Carl Deutsch's sobering words that a nation is, quote, a group of people united by a mistaken view of the past and a hatred of its neighbors. As I move towards my conclusion, I must push back on this tendency to despair in this era of cruelty, bigotry, and plutocracy. First, let's consider Toni Morrison's uplifting words. Speaking in another troubled time, after the videotaped police assault on Rodney King and the riots that ignited in LA in 1992, Morrison offered the University of Michigan's graduating class wise advice that I hope encourages us, reminding us of the value of our effort to pursue the truth in history, especially the history of racism and anti-racism, however unpopular that may be. She articulated a vision of honest, critical engagement with history that I hope is reflected in my research and writing on Jim Crow, Georgia, and the black-led struggle to liberate Georgia and UGA to democratize both, striving for justice in a political and educational system that lacked it. Toni Morrison explained that while it may be true that the future, your future, is in your hands, the past is also in your hands. Concentrating heavily on changing and managing the future, we don't realize the past is changeable as well. Of all the adages, the ones about refusing to cry over spilt milk, that life goes on, let the dead bury its dead, these sayings encourage us to get on with it and not to worry about yesterday or last year or last century. I disagree, wrote Morrison. History has a flexible side. Of course, it can be repeated disastrously or be reformed in new guises, but it can also be critiqued. It can be analyzed, and artists can reinvent it so it yields new information about itself, about the present as well as the future. And each time we critique and examine it, it can deliver other information and insight that in fact changes the way we know about it. That is the urgent enterprise these days when blood and rage bubble together in the streets. My point is, and this is a point that I hope we really remember, you are not bound by the future, and more important, you are not bound by the past. The past could be more liberating than the future if you're willing to identify its evasions, its distortions, its lies, and unleash its secrets and its truths. So, she concluded, I want to wish you not only the brightest of futures, but also the best of pasts. Earlier this month, my NYU students felt the power of these truths that Toni Morrison articulated, and so did I, in reacting to Charlene Hunter Galt's visit to our session exploring the history and lessons of UGA's integration crisis. In their journals and essays, the students commented upon how inspired they were to learn from Hunter Galt that even in difficult times, it was possible to persist in resisting racism and even to retain the optimistic conviction that, as MLK put it, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Or as Charlene told my students, it's not that we will endure, it's we shall overcome. Coming from Charlene, who together with Hamilton Holmes persisted and shattered UGA's color line, despite the racism directed at them, even violently, her words came across not as sunny platitudes, but as historical truth learned and earned from experience. The timing of our session with Hunter Galt made the past seem alive and present, her insights prescient and even precious. As one of my students, a female African-American drama major, explained, just a few days before I saw the photo of the effigy in life, she's referring to a chilling image that conveyed the racism of a well-dressed UGA fraternity member who in January 1961's Life magazine photo that I had shown the class, and in my book, is seen smiling broadly while dangling a lynched black puppet on a string amidst the campus integration crisis. She continued, I even more felt the great significance of our conversation with Hunter Galt. On that same day, many HBSUs as well as NYU received threats of racist violence. It felt alarmingly cyclical. The reality is that these hateful ideas haven't gone away. They never did. The hatred today is directed at diversity, equity, and inclusion, my student wrote. I don't even think Charlene knows, but she comforted me in that moment. The student wrote, it was, she concluded, Charlene's optimism and keeping Hamilton's memory alive and honoring his achievements that I've held on to from her response to a question about the uncanny parallels between her experience in the early 60s and today's world. As the pendulum seems to be swinging back to the right in an attempt to cover up the impact of students like herself in Hamilton, Charlene continued to stress the importance of education and said that if they could overcome racism then, it could be done now, my student wrote. And I think that that's the key, she wrote. She would know better than anyone. Without my having to tell them, my students had learned that in Faulkner's words, the past is not dead, it's not even past. They had reflected on both the history and the endurance of racism, not just in the South. That there were lessons also about the possibilities of overcoming racism that were as meaningful in New York in 2025 for my students as they had been for Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes in Athens, Georgia in 1961. This left me hopeful that my students' rising generation of Americans could help pull us out of the Trump era with its censorship of black history, its crude politics of racial resentment, and its blindness to anti-black racism, so that America could dare to do what my students, Charlene and Hamilton, had done, confronting Jim Crow and its legacy. And I hope my book will be of some use in that confrontation. Thank you.